you.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us, watching live with Faye on YouTube. And it's going to be a very interesting discussion because I've really arm twisted our guests into going back to the basics with us. Before we get started, of course, remember to like, share, subscribe to our channel, let friends and family know as well that we're here. We're doing this every evening. And so if you're sick of the mainstream prime time yelling at each other, which you may be, this is a good alternative where you can find out what's going on in the country and understand the issues a little better. Obviously, there's been some interesting conversation taking place about the fact that the IMF has put out a report saying Bangladesh's per capita GDP would be higher than India by the end of this year. And that sparked a lot of discussion, including some sources from the finance ministry who've spoken to some portions of the media and clarified that the calculation is a little different and it's not something we should be particularly alarmed about. So I thought, let's pedal back a little bit and go back to understand what GDP is, how it's calculated. And like one person on Twitter asked me, should regular people like you and me actually care about GDP at all? Does it affect us in any way? And then we very politely asked Professor Santosh Mehrotra and Mr. Mohan Guruswamy, very senior economists, to actually take us through the first class of economics, which is how is GDP calculated, and they've been kind enough to agree. Hopefully we won't bore them with our questions. But questions are open. So for our viewers, pop in, ask your questions. This is what we're going to do. We're going to very quickly try and understand the concept of GDP because it keeps coming up and we keep talking about it. And there are predictions and there are numbers that are released. This is a good way. If you haven't understood GDP, let's figure it out right now. Gentlemen, thank you so much for agreeing to do this basics of economics class with us. I really appreciate your time. Professor Mehrotra, I'll start with you with a very basic question of what GDP is and how it's calculated.
Right. So I think it's the value of goods and services produced in the country. Notice what I said, the value of goods and services. Because you cannot aggregate so many fish with so many liters of oil and so on. Therefore, you have to estimate a value for it. And then you aggregate it across all these products and also services. But you know, the one formula that everyone should try and remember is the following: C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Now, if those who are listening actually note this down, then I'll break it up for you. The C is consumption, I is investment, G is government expenditure. This is the expenditure method, okay? And then X minus M is exports minus imports. So consumption is the private final consumption of all goods and services. In other words, what you and I spend on things, and this, by the way, contributes or constitutes roughly about 60% of the country's GDP. So it is actually the largest share. The next is I, which is investment. So okay, so if you have a certain amount of income, of which part of it you consume and you save a little bit, then what do you do with the saving? You put it away in the bank, and that saving in the bank is then used by those who can make investments in producing goods or producing IT services or producing, you know, airline services for you. That's the investment. So what is not consumed is, let's say, invested. That's private investment. Let's turn to G, which is government expenditure. Having dealt with consumption expenditure, investment expenditure, now we deal with, because the first two were all private. The third one is government expenditure. Now, government expenditure will consist of both government consumption as well as government investment. So in other words, there's a bit of C and a bit of I in government expenditure. And clearly what we would like to see is government, when it collects revenues from us, whether it's non-tax revenues, like which might be generated by public sector enterprises, or tax revenues, which could be GST or direct taxes, personal income tax you might pay, or corporate tax. So whatever revenues the government generates, it should spend um, a significant part of it to invest it in bettering our roads, in establishing hospitals, in establishing schools, in creating police services and judiciary, in paying our legislators, and so on. So that's the government expenditure on sort of salaries, but then the investment in a hospital or building of a school is the investment part of government expenditure. Of course, if the government paying salaries to teachers or paying salaries to doctors, that's the consumption part. Okay, so that's G for you. Now let's look at X minus M. Now X is exports and minus M is the imports. So the net exports of the country, X minus M, is what then gets added on to the GDP. Because obviously, what you're exporting, you are not consuming domestically. What you're exporting is not figuring in any of the other categories. And what you're importing is, of course, coming in from abroad. It's been produced abroad, so you can't count it in your. Therefore, but you're still spending on the imports. Therefore, it's X minus M. So this is what is called the expenditure method. And if we keep these simple ideas in mind, I think it becomes really quite helpful to get a macro picture. And that's why it's called macroeconomics. Okay, so let me stop there. I think I've said enough.
Okay, and I'll come back to that. But for our audience, who didn't manage to jot that down, we've put it up on the screen so you can look at that as well. That's the formula that the professor just took us through. Let me ask Mr. Guruswamy this question. And I always tell our audience that Mr. Guruswamy said, "What? You're going to take me back to the books from 50 years ago?" But I want to understand this. Who makes this calculation? And like Professor Mehrotra told us, it is the value of goods, right? So how does someone sitting in Delhi establish the value of all the tomatoes we grew in one quarter and all the fish that was fished out of the ocean in that same quarter and all the boots that were made by the factories that are making boots? How is it possible to arrive at that number, Mr. Guruswamy?
You see, this data is collected from hundreds of sources. For instance, you have production data coming into the various industries departments in the states. There is excise collection. They also know how much of production that took place in certain industries. So all this data, so there are estimates of how much of food was produced, how much of wheat was produced. All these are good estimates. You don't really get the actual figure till after the year is over. But you can get reasonably accurate estimates. For instance, if you're going to get 20 quintals of wheat from an acre, in a particular acre, it's going to be 20 or 20.05, But its approximation of 20 is okay. So you get all these estimates, thousands of estimates. You got the NSSO survey, all kinds of huge body of people are working with data. All this data is collected. And it's also fiddled around with a little bit from time to time. If you look at GDP growth rates, you will find that towards the election, they'll always spike. Because, well, they are a little more generous in their estimations and additions. So, but there's a tendency to do that. It may be incidental, but I've studied GDP growths for the last 30 years, and I noticed a spike towards elections. So a lot of fiddling does take place in government. So you'll have to take this with the picture. That's why we have all these disputes, all these slanging matches on your channels, which you alluded to. Because we have different ways of looking at it. And people try to take it to advantage. And then there are different methods of calculating GDP. Professor Mehrotra gave expenditure method, there's a consumption method, total value of all goods and services produced. We add it all together. So, you'll get a different growth rates between the different methodologies. He might be more up to date with the methods, but the Chinese get consistently higher GDPs because their method of calculating GDP is different from ours. So they always automatically will get a 2% jump over you. So there are all kinds of things with statistics, there are statistics and statistics and, some lies also to it. So, like the Chinese say that, you always water the milk a bit to show good growth.
Yes.
But you also can change your base years for calculation. You have a 2001 base year, 2002 base year. Suddenly you say 2014 is the base year because, that was a particularly low year, so you jump higher. We all kind of games.
So one sec, let me just stop you there. So the base year is basically the year from which I compare, because effectively GDP growth is the percentage of growth difference between the last year at the same time and this year. So if I change the year that I'm starting from, actually I could either make myself look much better or much worse.
Actually, what happened in 2014, that the base year was changed. Till then, the UPA government was looking very good. They had averaged about 8% annually for their tenure, for the 10-year period. And suddenly, the base year was changed, and then the NDA government started saying, we are doing better. Now, this is a little fudging involved here. You're actually not doing better. And then they said that we're counting more data. For instance, 14 cobblers in Matunga were not counted. So we're going to count them in. So you start adding these things in and get better growth rates. But I think overall, people have a good idea of sense of well-being. So you can have very high growth rates, but actually become poorer, as this happened in our country. Majority of people have actually become poorer. Because poverty is always relative.
Yes.
Something prices are going up, so you consume less. Now, if the growth accrues to 1% of the population, 1% of the population to 73% of the growth in the last 10 years. That means 99% grew, got very little. Obviously, you're going to get poorer. So your per capita income went up, GDP went up, but who got it? So you're going to factor that with income inequality. If income equality is getting high, then there is something problematic. So that means there are a lot more poor people. At the time of, say, independence, we had 280 million people below the poverty line. Today, after 70 years, we have 320 million people. Have you made a change? There are more people starving every day. The same number of people are starving. So have you moved on? So there are different ways of looking at it, and you can keep looking at it from so many ways. And, you can look good or you can look bad according to where you're looking at it from.
Yes. Let me now take this back to the professor. Professor Mehrotra, the question of per capita GDP, which, simply from the name one could understand is the total GDP divided by the total population. Is per capita GDP, in your opinion, an important way to check or important way to gauge the progress of our country or any country? Do you think that that's a helpful way? Because the IMF's argument of per capita GDP is what is being looked at right now.
Yes and no. Sorry for sounding confusing, but let me put it like this. I think you figured out from what Mohan was saying is that it's a relatively crude estimate. And this is a criticism that has been historically made of GDP. However, the estimate of the population is not a crude estimate. It is actually a fairly robust estimate of the number of people. Okay. Now, the point is that you may be growing at 5% per annum, but if your population growth rate is 3.5% per annum, then you are only actually per capita income is growing at only 1.5% per annum, which is pathetic because that's not going to reduce poverty. In fact, something similar was happening in our country from 1950 to 1980, because our GDP growth rate was just 3.5% per annum. Our population was growing at 2.5% per annum. So over a 30-year period, our per capita income was increasing at only 1% per annum. As a result, as population was growing, the number of poor people would have also been growing, for the simple reason that 1% per capita income growth is simply not good enough for pulling up people at the bottom of the pyramid. So we already were a relatively poor country. We sort of obviously would have begun to see much greater inequality now. So this is the point about per capita income. So it's a very important measure. It must grow consistently over long periods of time. Notice what I said. Consistently over long periods of time, and only if it grows will the government be able to generate enough revenues, because it's incomes which get taxed, which come to the government, which then plows it back into health and education and judiciary and police and so on. So it's absolutely critical that GDP must grow and the population growth rate is pulled down. However, how do you pull down the population growth rate in order to increase the difference between the two? The way you do it, and look, there is the circularity here. There's a problem here, that the way you reduce the population growth rate is by investing in people's education, because that changes their behavior. And
Yes.
secondly, by investing in people's health, because if you give all poor people the surety that their children once born, they will not die. In other words, the infant mortality rate is not high, it's low. Then they will not have more children, because then they are sure that their children once born, they will continue to live. So they don't have to overcompensate by having too many children. And the poverty of our health has actually impacted tended to raise our population growth rate for a 30-year period. So our population growth rate, which was less than half a percentage point before 1947, actually, as I said, kept growing every decade between 1950 and 1981. Every decade it grew, and it peaked at around 2.5%. And since then, it has been on a declining trend. So one way you can actually increase per capita income is simply reduce the population growth rate. In other words, invest in your people so that you improve their health and education, and automatically per capita incomes begin to grow. Obviously, the other side of the equation must also be, has to be, you have to have the right policies, because 3.5% is very poor for a country which has so many poor people. So compare us to, for instance, South Korea. South Korea was growing at 6 to 7% per annum for the first 20 years, but they also rapidly reduced. They became independent around the same time of the Japanese, and yet they managed to bring down their population growth rate sharply by investing in their education. We didn't invest in our people's school education, elementary education. So let me stop there, because otherwise I'd go on too long.
Well, the next question that actually should come up at this point is the comparison of the per capita GDP that Professor Mehrotra has explained to us with Bangladesh. Mr. Guruswamy, I'll bring that question to you. Now, let's put it up on the screen again. The IMF has put out a comparison saying Bangladesh's per capita GDP is likely to be higher than India by the end of this year. That's their estimate. Is this something that should worry us, Mr. Guruswamy, or do you think that it's one of those comparisons that actually, it's interesting statistics, but shouldn't really be of concern?
No, it should concern us, because, at one time, Bangladesh was considered the basket case of the world. That's what Kissinger called it. It will never grow. And they've shown, as Santosh has shown, by investing in education, investing in primary health, investing in improving agriculture productivity, they've shown that you can actually grow. And they're growing well, and they're growing consistently. And they also have a large export base now. Their net exports are more than us. We are huge importers still. And that takes away from your GDP growth rate. With X minus M, remember, if M is consistently more, and you have to take that much out of your GDP. So Bangladesh does better on that score. I have another feeling that Bangladesh does even better than us on income inequality. Our income inequality today is among the highest in the world, over 0.68. Bangladesh is at about 4. That means wealth is more evenly spread. So, if you take the average Indian, today if you account for which percentile is getting how much, the average Indian is pretty close to our poverty line. Majority. So, you have to factor that into account. You have a, like I said the other day in your program, government employees take away 11.5% of GDP. They are the highest paid cohort in the country. Then you've got people in industry, people who work in factories. All these are high wage. This is the organized labor. These are all high wage pockets. Then you have this vast array of 410 million people or something who live on daily wages. Daily wage, since labor is in excess supply, daily wages are always depressed. If you want to pay 200 rupees a day for something, you always get somebody else who will offer to do it for 180. Because he needs the job, he needs to feed his family. So, daily wages again are low for that 410 million people. So, unless you get more people into the organized sector, your average Indian is getting worse off. And that's something you got to keep your eye on. You just can't keep saying, I'm growing.
So if I understand what you're saying, basically you're saying that because Bangladesh has had a strong export, culture, and they've managed to grow at a certain rate every year for the last couple of decades, that their GDP has gone up. But also in comparison in India, we have a widening gap between the rich and the poor. So your GDP could be a certain amount, but if all of that money is actually centered with the rich and is not being adequately distributed with the poor, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone in the country is doing well. And even on that count, you say that we're worse off than Bangladesh. Professor Mehrotra, there's a question from Bharat Rawal. Also, I want to acknowledge Vishal Agnihotri, Rohit Fadnis, and Chokalinga Kaviraj for supporting us. But Bharat Rawal's question is, I've heard that GDP shouldn't be the measuring criteria. Per capita income should be the measuring criteria. Is this true? And as per the IMF, we're behind Bangladesh in that as well. Is that also true? Professor Mehrotra.
I think we've already answered that question, really, because look, you have to first estimate the GDP, and from that, you can estimate the per capita GDP, because you have projections for the country's population in a particular year, for that same year for which you've calculated the gross domestic product. So I don't think there's any,
the difference between per capita income and per capita GDP, is that the same thing?
Broadly it's the same. Broadly the same. This is a mistaken notion. Let's not get into the fine points about the differences between GDP and GNP. I think let's not go there. It's unnecessary in a television program like this.
Okay.
But it's absolutely critical for people to understand that GDP per capita, both are important, and they must be sustained in our country over the next 20 years, that our demographic dividend is still around, when the young are joining the labor force every year in larger and larger numbers, that our GDP growth must be sustained. Now let me turn to the poverty and the inequality issue. And I'll bring in the differences that have emerged between the north of the country and the south of the country in this regard. Now notice, the first point is that until 1973-74, we didn't have robust estimates of poverty in our country. Since 73, 74, however, because we have done consumption expenditure surveys, and in our country, poverty, income poverty or consumption poverty, as it's called in our country, is data is collected, and therefore we are able to estimate the number of the poor and the share of the population which is below the poverty line, a nationally determined poverty line, consistently. So from 73 onwards, every 5 years, we were doing a consumption expenditure survey. So we were able to estimate the number of the poor. Now notice what happens. Between 73 and in 73, 74, by what was called the Lakdawala poverty line. Lakdawala, because he was a member of the Planning Commission, he was the chair of this task force, which arrived at this methodology. And actually, when I joined the Planning Commission in 2006, and it was the Planning Commission which used to do the estimate based on the consumption expenditure survey carried out by the NSSO. The number of the poor by the Lakdawala poverty line in 73, 74 was 320 million. In 83, 84, by the same poverty line, the number of the poor was still 320 million. In 93, 94, it was still 320 million. But the population was growing. So the fact that the number of the poor remained the same is in some ways an achievement. However, not much of an achievement, because clearly the absolute number of the poor is remaining the same. There may be some people who might be rising above the poverty line, but others who are falling below the poverty line. I know and remember these numbers because I wrote the chapter in the 11th five-year plan for rural poverty. Now notice what happens, and I'm going to draw the connection to GDP growth. You see, until 93, 94, 93 in particular, please remember that our GDP growth rate had increased from 1980 onwards, but not increased that much. In the 80s, the growth rate jumped from the preceding 30-year average of 3.5% to about 5.5%. The point is that it's only in the 90s and the 2000s that our GDP growth rate perked up very significantly, while at the same time, the population growth rate was falling sharply. Today, the population growth rate is around 1% per annum. Okay. Now, point is that because our GDP growth was increasing from the 90s onwards, we begin to see some decline in the absolute number of the poor for the first time in India's post-independence history. Between 93, 94, it fell, but by a minuscule 18 million, it came down to merely 302 million. Okay, this is in 2004. Now listen to what happens. The government revises the poverty line. The Planning Commission revises the poverty line, raises the poverty line compared to the Lakdawala one. And now listen to what happens. Because the growth rate is much greater and the population growth rate is falling, the absolute number of poor in the country fell by a whopping 140 million over a 7-year period from 2004-5 to 11-12. Why? Because of the GDP growth rate being phenomenal. Now let me come to Mohan's point about inequality. Mohan's absolutely right that at the same time, the rich were becoming richer, inequality was increasing, but at the same time, poverty fell. The absolute number of poor fell. Now, if 140 million people come out of poverty because incomes are growing so fast, why? Because jobs are growing very fast. And when jobs grow very fast, especially when workers are pulled out of agriculture, the labor market tightens, then real wages rise. So non-agri jobs are growing, real wages are growing. So the number of poor falls and falls very sharply. So, okay, so I'm summarizing now. Because I want to bring the story up to date, going beyond 2012 to 2019. The point is that the growth rate really seriously fell post 2012 in the last 2 years because of the policy paralysis of the UPA. But under this government, on account of the mismanagement of the economy, the growth rate has actually systematically fallen, regardless of what the government's claims are. Okay, we can come back to that. And there have been many systematic and criticisms of the government's claims about what the GDP, their GDP growth rates are. So what did the consumption expenditure survey tell us in 2018? It told us the following, that between 2012 and 2018, rural consumption expenditure actually fell by 8%. Fell for the first time in India's history. And urban consumption expenditure rose by barely 2% over an 8-year period. Therefore, it means that for at least 4-year period that the NDA was in power, there was an increase in poverty. There has never been an increase in poverty. This is the first time in India's post-independence history that we are seeing an increase in poverty, for God's sake. And post-pandemic, there is a contraction of the economy which will continue all of this year, probably continue into next year. There'll be contraction next year also compared to 1920 levels. But the population is still growing. You will see more poverty, not just this year, more poverty next year than you already had in 2018-19. Are you beginning to see here the catastrophe that this country is going through? It is nothing short of a catastrophe. These migrant workers who've gone back to their villages, they are selling their children. There's trafficking of children taking place. Headline story was in the Indian Express was yesterday there. Why? There's a revival of trafficking of children, of selling their children, for God's sake. Let me pause there.
Well, this poverty line is very interesting. Now, we have a poverty line which is fairly arbitrary. It's based on, as long as you get a certain minimum caloric value, food, and a few other things. But if you take a basic quality of life index, what does a person need? What does a family need? Access to clean water in the house, toilet, access to transport, access to a road, access to a school, and a good diet, a balanced diet. You start factoring all that in, then your poverty level increases. In 2003, I did a paper on a new poverty line for a new India. And it was widely published, quoted everywhere. It was published in EPW in India and various journals abroad. And it was widely covered, and it was discussed in Parliament. Then former Prime Minister Chandrasekhar raised the issue in Parliament, and he gave all the members of Parliament a copy. And the Minister for Rural Development, R.P. Singh, who just died the other day, Raghunandan Prasad Singh.
Raghuvansh Prasad.
Raghuvansh Prasad. We are going to use this methodology because this is the way to do it. But if you just see people are going, so I said, if starvation and enough food is the criteria, caloric criteria, then you put a bag of wheat outside everybody's house. Then you say, I've taken care of poverty. But you got to provide a standard of living. So, by that standard of living index, if you take about now $3 a day, then over 65% of India is below that line. We don't follow the UNDP index or basic standard of living. We have our own index. But if you start using a different index, if your number of poor people increase, then you will target government policy to tackle that. Providing access to education, providing access to transportation, providing access to clean drinking water, all that you want to target. You don't do that. So this methodology has not changed very much. So therefore, I always call it a starvation line. If you get less than that, you're going to have less food to eat in the house that day. So that is something we also have to factor. We have a lot of arbitrary things. Because otherwise, government will not have this kind of money to spend on telecom, on airlines. In 1 year, I noticed that we spent more money on civil aviation than on irrigation. Something on which 80% of India lives, we spent less money on that. And on civil aviation, we spend more money. But that kind of pattern continues. So you get this skewed pattern of government investment.
So I have a couple of questions to take from. Yes.
You say that the poverty line, this is our definition of poverty line, and we're going to reduce this number. And then your public spending also changes, your focus of government changes, everything else will change.
So my next question to both of you is this, and it's coming up a lot among our viewers as well. Is it possible for India to recover from where we are right now? How soon can that happen? And what would this environment of a massive difference between rich and poor, a widening gap, a larger number of people who fall under the poverty line? What does this mean for the young people of this country right now, who are effectively inheriting this problem? So first question is, how long is it likely to take for us to recover? And I want to keep in mind the fact that both of these gentlemen have spent the last couple of weeks telling us that the government is not doing what it needs to do. So assuming that this continues for a while, how long will it take us to recover? Mr. Guruswamy?
Well, you see, this year, the IMF says that our contraction is going to be the order of 10.3%.
Yes.
Others have said that it could be 13%. I personally feel that even these two figures are optimistic. I personally feel, with my rough calculations, without access to the kind of data which people in JNU and others will have, that we will actually contract by about 16 to 17%. Because that is the kind of loss of revenue we are seeing. That's the kind of unemployment we're seeing. So you'll have a decline which is going to be fairly large. And then you recover from that. It's going to take you about 3 years to come back to the old level, assuming that you're going to go at 6%. It'll take you 3 years to recover your 18% which you lost. Then you come back to our level 4 years from now, to last year's level. So imagine how much of time we're going to lose, basically because of the government's unwillingness to borrow money and spend more money. In a crisis like this, you have to spend money to get out. Every large economy which fought its way out of a depression did it by spending and creating jobs. Suddenly,
the IMF has also estimated that next year India will recover at a growth rate of plus 8.8%. Professor Mehrotra, does that mean, so according to the IMF, we're going to lose 10.5%. According to the RBI, it's about 9.5%. But if it comes back 8%, then effectively, are we still down 1 or 2% next year?
13.8.
Exactly. So yes, let's assume that the IMF numbers are correct for the moment, just for argument's sake. And please remember that the IMF had seriously, grossly mistakenly estimated plus 2% or something like that for the financial year 21 at the beginning of this crisis, and then they've revised it anyway. Never mind that. So if it's plus 8%, you put your finger on it. You're absolutely right, Faye, that because of the sharp decline, sharp contraction, we get a base effect. It's called a base effect, that, whatever you grow, it will be better than last year. So you get plus 8%. What does that mean? You are still roughly 2 percentage points below 1920 level. Because this minus 10% that the IMF is projecting for FY21 is by comparison to FY20, right? So next year, no question. That means 2 years gone completely. That means we have to wait till FY22 in the best case scenario. And this is all assuming that 8% is going to happen and that 10% the contraction is okay. In fact, it could be more. And the increase in output in next FY21, 22 will be even less than the 8%. So in other words, I'm going to repeat what I was saying earlier. You are going to see an increase in poverty even further beyond income poverty, consumption poverty. Please appreciate. So I fully buy the distinction that Mohan is making between money metric measure of poverty in income or consumption poverty versus a non-money metric measure. A non-money metric measure would be, what is my state of well-being? My state of well-being is dependent upon, do I have enough food? Am I healthy? In other words, do I have health services? My children are getting educated or not? It depends on those sorts of things. Do I have enough clean water to drink, etc. Those are the non-money metric dimensions. And by the non-money, are my children malnourished? 35, we already know in 2016, 35% of India's under 5-year-olds were malnourished. This is the worst. This is worse than Africa. So when you have children being sold in the post-pandemic period, then you can imagine how severe the non-money metric poverty is going, how much severer non-money metric poverty is going to become. Children are going to be pulled out of school. People will not be able to pay for health services. Private hospitals are fleecing people on a daily basis. Max Hospital in Saket in Delhi has just fleeced us. My son-in-law has just come out of a dengue 15 days stay. I have no hesitation in saying this because they are fleecing people. The private sector is making money hand over fist, especially the private hospitals at this point of time, and the government is doing nothing. There is no regulation. This is pathetic. And this is the reason why Mohan was saying that inequality in our country is going to increase on top of poverty increasing. In other words, the number of the poor is going to grow. This is a catastrophe. I'm repeating myself. This is a catastrophe that we have never seen in the history of our country. And the government of our country is failing us miserably. Can you imagine? I might have a capacity to pay the private hospital. Do you think poor people have the capacity to pay? They don't. They end up going to quacks. And if they go to quacks, then their children die. What does that mean? That, Max Hospital can actually fleece people?
Yes. In fact, there have been various studies in our, including at Oxfam, they put out studies saying that it is actually healthcare that bankrupts Indian families completely, where they take loans, sell their homes, sell all their possessions when one family member needs treatment, and they're sent to private hospitals. And of course, we know the inadequacy of our education system that keeps our poor people poor. Last question. This one is from Chinmay Mukhopadhyay. He says, can we get the panelists' view on the following? Arguments can be made for both schools of thought, capitalism and socialism. Is there a middle path? Should India follow it to make progress more inclusive? We don't have that kind of time really to argue between capitalism and socialism, but I will ask our panelists to weigh in on what is the recipe for inclusive progress or inclusive growth in India, because we've heard this phrase being used and bandied about through UPA 1 and 2 and through this government as well. Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas is effectively translated to inclusive growth. But we haven't, in either of these governments, let me make it very clear, we haven't really managed to achieve that. The rich just continue to become richer. What are we doing wrong, Mr. Guruswamy?
There is a relationship between growth and equity. Unless you have growth, your savings will not increase. And unless the savings increase, you cannot invest. Only when you invest, you get equity. But if you have large inequity, then you will not get growth. So there is a balance you got to maintain and also have order in society at the same time. So there's growth, there's equity, there's order. And you got to make investments for the future. You got to do all these things. So, like Deng said, I don't care if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches the mice. So there are different ways of doing it in India. Like you got to, like Dr. Mehrotra says, emphasis on education, on health, because that is good economics. It is not welfare. It's good economics. Investment on irrigation is good economics. Investment on rural roads, good economics. Don't think of it as welfare. Education is investment. Education is not a subsidy. A subsidy is when you give MSP. And you say, I'm going to pay 1,000 rupees more than the market price. Or when you're going to give fertilizers for the consumption of rich farmers. Or when you give milk cheap to urban dwellers. Those are subsidies. Sugar is subsidy. But there are merit subsidies like education has got to be merit subsidized, has to be free, has to be low cost, has to be equal. Today, we don't care about overall education standards because our children go to good urban schools. They come out speaking English like the English do, or even better, and they do well. But if you want to become a clerk in a bank, your interview is held in English. So what chance does a rural boy have? Or girl? So you got to have equality. Not only you should give people equality of benefits, you should also give them equality of opportunities. It's not an easy thing of this ism or that ism. It's a question of having a just society. It doesn't really matter whether you call it socialism or capitalism, you must be just. The problem is that we are not a just society. People who don't deserve get all the subsidies. For the last 30 years, we have spent more money on subsidizing the rich farmer than on capital investment in agriculture. We've not built any canals, we've not built any dams, we've not done anything. And we've given, so agriculture and food expenditure keeps going up. But where is it going? In the last 20 years, we have not created one irrigated acre, one new irrigated acre. Everything has been created by tube wells. So we give free power. So if you have a large piece of land, you dig in a tube well and you run the tube well the whole day and not bother about switching it off. So, that is socialism in a way. But that is not socialism. That is crony capitalism or crony socialism. There's crony socialism, there's crony capitalism. All systems, the cronies benefit. We have a typical crony culture.
Yes.
Because we don't have a sense of justice. Are we doing the right thing? Are we standing by people? We allow people to jump queues all the time. There's a VIP entrance, there's a VIP darshan in Tirupati. There's a ticket, 1,000 rupee ticket darshan, there's a 5 rupee ticket darshan. So, we're actually a very unjust society. And unless that changes, unless people start fighting for their rights, therefore I advocate, you might call it Leninist, I say that there must be 1 million mutinies every day. People must fight for their rights and ask questions. We don't do that, we're too pliant. Which is why we allow all these people to get away with their nonsense.
Yes. Well, gentlemen, we've actually, if you believe it or not, ran out of our 1 hour time having this conversation that Professor Mehrotra thought would last past 20 minutes. And there are still a bunch of questions that we could ask, but I don't want to stay my welcome. Professor Mehrotra and Mr. Guruswamy, thank you for answering our questions. Focus really... sorry, I didn't hear you.
Do one more discussion like this.
Yes, we must do one more.
What would we do if we were telling the government or the regime what to do?
I'm quite happy to ask you that question right now. Professor Mehrotra, if you were to advise the government at this point, and I think I've asked you this question a few weeks ago, what would you ask the government to do?
Right now, I would request the government to borrow money and spend on strengthening our public health infrastructure. Let's just remember the following, that if there is one state in the country which for the last 30 years has sustained growth for a long period of time, it is Kerala.
Absolutely.
Tamil Nadu is not dissimilar, and it has done exactly the same thing. How come? I have a very detailed paper, a very technical paper on this very subject, this sharp increase in the divide between North and South. And what I find from my analysis, I've done econometric analysis on this, on the relationship between the Human Development Index of each of these states and the GDP per capita of these states. And what one finds is that the states which invested in their people were the ones which sustained growth GDP growth over long periods of time. This is Indian evidence which I have econometrically established. It's going to appear in an international journal. At the same time, there's international evidence to precisely the same effect, Faye, that you invest in your own people, the result shows up in sustained growth, and the country needs sustained growth, not 8% per annum from 2004 to 14, and then suddenly you dip to 3, 4, 5%, and we will not. What we are going to see even after we return to 1920 level, my dear, in 2013, 2023, is no more than 5% per annum. When the number of entrants into the labor force is going to increase very sharply, they will go on increasing every year.
In a year.
Yes, and every year the unemployment will increase. Every year the unemployment will increase. The people will be on the streets demanding jobs. Can you imagine what we are in for now? We have no choice but to grow at 8% per annum between now and the next 20 years. No choice. But what are we building? What are we doing in the process? That we are laying the foundations for no more than 5% per annum beyond 2023. Can you imagine what the implication of that is? How much inequality will increase and how much poverty is going to grow? You ain't seen nothing yet, Faye. You ain't seen nothing yet.
Mr. Guruswamy, what would you tell the government?
I entirely agree with that. You have to rack up, spending on education and health, and on essential infrastructure like irrigation, roads, and all this. But there's a the major dictum in public administration is the nature of the regime determines the nature of the outcome. So unless government changes, unless people have a voice in government, unless people are running their own lives, you're not going to get these changes. If you have centralized, I always say that at the municipal, local government level, we have only 10% of our government employees there. We have 90% at the state capitals, district capitals, and in the union capital. So I always say that for every one person who's doing something for you, you have 9 people who are telling you what to do. So that emphasis should change. Why should a school in a district be run from a state capital? Why should teachers be appointed from the state capital? Why can't the school run with a local committee? Why does JNU have to function under the Department of Education in Delhi? I know what Havoc deputy secretaries do. I was on the board of governors of a well-known institution. The committee would decide all kinds of things, but the deputy secretary said, no, you can't do this because I have to get it cleared from my secretary and from my minister. So you're under jackboots all the time. Why should you have that? So you've got to decentralize government. Your hospitals should be under local authorities. In the old days, we used to have district hospital board. We used to have district education boards. All those have been disbanded. You have highly centralized structures. If a teacher doesn't teach in a school, doesn't come to school, in a village, there's nothing the villager can do. Every time I go to a village, people complain, the teacher hasn't come, the doctor is not coming to the PHC. Then they ask you what to do. I mean, sometimes when people are not looking, I say, the guy comes again, tie him up to a tree. Or keep him locked in a room and say, you can't go till we give you permission to go. But that's actually breaking law and order down. But what do people do to get control of their lives? You have a PHC, 80% of PHCs are unmanned. Doctors don't go there. They don't have medicines, they don't have furniture, nothing. Patients lie on the floor. Pigs and dogs are floating around small hospitals. That's because local people have no say in it. Even large hospitals in Hyderabad, where I'm living, don't have a hospital visitors board. So, we've lost say in the government. People have lost it. You can't even get the garden in front of the house swept because the municipal sweeper who gets paid 30,000 rupees a month is not willing to come and sweep every day. Many sweepers actually in Delhi, it has been discovered, actually subcontract their work out. They have other sweepers appointed. And he comes there and stands there. I've seen a guy, in New Friends Colony when I used to live there, wearing jeans and a t-shirt and standing there. He was a sweeper. But he used to get supervise other people. It had two other guys to do his work. And still pocket about 10,000 rupees a month. So, but residents have no say in it.
Right.
You have to break it down to resident welfare associations, local mohalla committees, all these things. So every government has come to Delhi. Manmohan Singh came and said, my first challenge is to reform government. Modi says, my first challenge is reform government. Haven't done anything. They're in the hands of bureaucrats who don't want to change anything. So I think you have to combine both. You just can't attend to economic problems and leave structures, management structures as it is. When a company goes bad, you've been a business correspondent, you restructure the company, you restructure the business, you reinvent yourself. You're going to reinvent government in this country. It's a major task.
Well, we're going to leave it here, and I want to thank both of our panelists for giving us what obviously our audience says is a show that they can come back to and watch many times over in order to fully understand it. But there is plenty to be done, and I believe as audiences of this show, at least one of the things that we should do is read about what's going on with our economy, understand what's going on with our economy, and demand better from our government, both center and state. Demand investments and focus in the right places, demand better care for the poor of our country, because this is not charity, like has been pointed out by both of our guests. And this is something really important, because we keep falling to that argument of, why should we distribute anything for free? People expect to be given handouts in our country. This is not handouts. This is good economics to invest in education, invest in food, invest in health, so that we can improve the quality of life of the poor and thereby improve the quality of life in our entire country. But we're going to come back to have more conversations like this so we can understand these challenges better, because it's only when we understand how this works. And unfortunately, like we keep saying, school doesn't teach us enough of this. It's only when we understand how the country works can we demand better from our government. And that's fundamentally the aim behind all of these shows. So thank you to both of our guests for being so kind and so patient and answering all our questions. And thank you to our audience for joining us. Thanks for watching. Good night.